The Golden Gate Bridge stands majestically against the backdrop of a foggy San Francisco morning in October 1987. The iconic red towers pierce through the mist like ancient sentinels, watching over the churning waters below. Detective Frank Morrison, recently retired from the SFPD after 30 years of service, sits in his weathered Buick sedan, parked at the vista point overlooking the bridge. His weathered hands grip a lukewarm cup of coffee as he stares at the structure that has become both his obsession and his curse. Frank is a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and deep-set brown eyes that have seen too much. The lines on his face tell stories of countless nights spent pursuing justice, of cases that kept him awake long after his shift ended. But there's one case that never left him, one that forced him into early retirement, not because he wanted to, but because he had to know the truth. The morning fog rolls in from the Pacific, wrapping around the bridge's cables like ghostly fingers. Frank takes another sip of his coffee and opens a manila folder filled with newspaper clippings, police reports, and his own handwritten notes. The headlines scream of tragedy. Third person missing near Golden Gate Bridge this month. Police baffled by Waterside disappearances. Families demand answers. But before we dive deeper into Frank's investigation, let's take a moment to explore this mystery together. If you're fascinated by stories that blend human drama with compelling mysteries, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming tales that explore the darker corners of human nature. Frank's story begins 3 months earlier when he was still wearing the badge. It was a Tuesday night in July when the first call came in. Officer Martinez, a rookie with barely 6 months on the force, radioed in about abandoned belongings found on the pedestrian walkway of the Golden Gate Bridge. A purse, a pair of shoes, and most peculiarly, a trail of wet footprints leading from the items to the railing. And then nothing. The belongings were identified as those of Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old nurse who worked the night shift at UCSF Medical Center. Sarah was described by her colleagues as dedicated and reliable, someone who never missed a shift and always stayed late to help with difficult cases. Her apartment in the Richmond district showed no signs of struggle, no indication that she had planned to disappear. Her car was found parked legally near Crissy Field, about a half-mile walk from where her belongings were discovered. What troubled Frank most about Sarah's case wasn't just the mysterious circumstances of her disappearance, but the witness testimony that began to emerge. 3 different people, all interviewed separately, reported seeing a woman in distress near the bridge around 3:30 a.m. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A young woman in what appeared to be wet clothing, approaching pedestrians and asking for help in a voice described as desperate and pleading. Marcus Williams, a night shift janitor who regularly walked across the bridge as part of his commute home, was the most detailed witness. He told Frank that he encountered this woman on the night Sarah disappeared. "She came out of nowhere, man," Marcus had said, his hands shaking as he recounted the experience. "Soaking wet, like she'd been swimming or something. She grabbed my arm and started crying, saying someone was after her, that she needed help. I was going to call the cops, but then I heard footsteps behind us, heavy boots on the metal walkway. When I turned around, there were 2 men approaching, and they didn't look friendly." Marcus described how the woman suddenly became terrified when she saw the men. She whispered, "Please don't let them take me," and then she just ran toward the waterside of the bridge. The men followed her, and I should have done something, but I was scared. By the time I worked up the courage to follow, they were all gone. Just gone. Frank had pressed Marcus for more details about the men, but the witness could only provide vague descriptions. Tall, wearing dark clothing, possibly carrying something that looked like rope or restraints. The incident had lasted less than 5 minutes. But it left Marcus so shaken that he changed his route home and never walked across the bridge at night again. The second disappearance occurred just 3 weeks later. Jennifer Walsh, a 32-year-old social worker who often worked with homeless populations in the city, vanished under remarkably similar circumstances. Her car was found parked near the bridge, her belongings discovered on the walkway, and again, Witnesses reported seeing a distressed woman in wet clothing asking for help around the same time. This time, the witness was Elena Rodriguez, a baker who started her shifts at 4 a.m. and often drove across the bridge on her way to work. Elena's account was even more disturbing than Marcus's. She had stopped her car when she saw what she thought was an accident victim stumbling along the pedestrian walkway. "I pulled over and rolled down my window," Elena told Frank during their interview. "This woman, she looked so scared, so desperate. Her hair was dripping wet and her dress was clinging to her body like she'd been in the water. She came to my car window and begged me to drive her away from there. She kept looking over her shoulder saying, 'They're coming, they're coming.' I was about to unlock my door when I saw them." Elena described seeing two figures emerge from the shadows near the bridge's support structure. They moved like they were hunting something. The woman saw them too and she just screamed. Not a normal scream, but something that came from pure terror. She ran toward the edge of the bridge, and these men, they followed her. I was so shocked I just sat there for a minute, and when I looked again, nobody was there, just the sound of the wind and the waves below. Unlike Marcus, Elena had the presence of mind to call the police immediately, but by the time patrol units arrived, there was no trace of anyone on the bridge except for Jennifer's abandoned belongings and those same wet footprints leading to the railing. The pattern was becoming clear to Frank, but his superiors at the SFPD were skeptical. Captain Rodriguez, a by-the-books administrator who cared more about clearance rates than unsolved mysteries, suggested that they were dealing with suicides, not crimes. "Look, Morrison," he had said during a tense meeting in his office, "people jump from that bridge. It's tragic, but it happens. These witness accounts, they're probably just seeing homeless people or drug addicts. You know how unreliable witness testimony can be, especially at that time of night." But Frank knew there was more to it. The wet clothing, the consistent timing, the mysterious men, these weren't random elements. Someone was using the bridge as a hunting ground. And the women weren't jumping. They were being taken. The third disappearance sealed Frank's conviction that they were dealing with something far more sinister than suicide. Rebecca Martinez, a 25-year-old graduate student at Berkeley, disappeared on a foggy September night. This time, there were two witnesses, and their accounts corroborated each other in ways that made Frank's blood run cold. Tom Harrison and his girlfriend Lisa Parks were driving home from a late dinner in Sausalito when they decided to stop and walk partway across the bridge. It was something they did occasionally, finding the nighttime view of the city romantic despite the cold wind and fog. Around 3:20 a.m., they encountered what Tom described as a scene from a nightmare. "We were about halfway across when we heard someone crying," Tom explained to Frank. "At first, we thought it might be someone contemplating, the worst. We've heard that happens there. But as we got closer, we realized it was a young woman, and she was soaking wet. Not just damp from the fog, but wet like she'd been underwater." Lisa continued the account. "She saw us and immediately ran toward us. She was terrified, looking back over her shoulder constantly. She grabbed Tom's jacket and started begging us to help her get away from them. She said they had taken her from her apartment, that they were going to sell her, and that she had managed to escape but they were hunting her." The couple described how Rebecca had explained that she had been kidnapped from her Berkeley apartment 3 days earlier. She had been held in what she described as a warehouse near the waterfront, along with several other women. She had managed to escape by jumping into the bay during a transfer between locations, swimming to shore, and making her way to the bridge where she hoped to find help. "She was hypothermic," Lisa recalled, "shivering uncontrollably, and her lips were blue. We were about to take her to our car, call the police, get her to a hospital, but then we heard them coming." Tom's description of what happened next would haunt Frank for months. These footsteps, heavy boots on the metal walkway, then voices, men calling out in what sounded like a foreign language. Rebecca went completely white. She whispered, "They found me." And then she did something I'll never forget. She looked at us with these desperate eyes and said, "Tell them Rebecca Martinez was here. Tell them I tried to get home." Then she climbed over the railing. Both witnesses insisted that Rebecca hadn't jumped. Instead, she had climbed down to a maintenance ledge below the main walkway, trying to hide. But the men, Tom counted at least 3 of them, had spotted her. Using ropes and what appeared to be professional climbing equipment, they had descended to her location and forcibly brought her back up to the bridge level. "We hid behind one of the support towers," Lisa admitted, her voice filled with guilt. "We should have tried to help, but there were too many of them and they looked dangerous. We heard Rebecca screaming, pleading with them, and then silence. When we finally looked out, they were all gone. No sign of anyone ever being there except for the wet marks on the walkway." This time, Frank had managed to process the scene before other officers arrived. The wet footprints were definitely there, along with rope marks on the railing where climbing equipment had been used. More importantly, he found something the perpetrators had dropped in their haste: a business card for a shipping company called Pacific Maritime Solutions, with an address in the industrial district near the port. Frank's investigation into Pacific Maritime Solutions revealed a complex web of legitimate business mixed with darker activities. The company was owned by Viktor Kozlov, a Russian immigrant who had arrived in San Francisco in the early 1980s. On the surface, Kozlov ran a successful import-export business, bringing in goods from Asia and Europe. But Frank's contacts in the FBI's organized crime unit painted a different picture. Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to the first victim, met with Frank at a downtown diner to discuss what the Bureau knew about Kozlov's operations. Agent Chen was a specialist in human trafficking cases, and she had been building a case against Pacific Maritime Solutions for over a year. "Kozlov is smart," she explained over coffee and eggs. "He uses his legitimate shipping business as cover for moving people. Young women, mostly from Eastern Europe and Asia, brought in as cargo and then sold into various forms of forced labor. Some end up in brothels, others in sweatshops, some in domestic slavery situations." Frank learned that the FBI had been monitoring Kozlov's operations, but had struggled to gather enough evidence for prosecution. The victims were too terrified to testify, and Kozlov's organization was careful to leave minimal traces of their activities. "What makes this case unusual," Agent Chen continued, "is that Kozlov's people have apparently started targeting local women as well. Usually, traffickers stick to imported victims because they're more isolated, don't speak the language well, have no local connections. But if your missing women were taken by Kozlov's crew, it suggests they're expanding their operations or that something has gone wrong with their usual supply chain." The Golden Gate Bridge, Agent Chen explained, was likely being used as a transfer point. "Think about it," she said. "It's isolated at night, easy to control access, and if something goes wrong, they can dispose of evidence quickly. The bay currents would carry away anything they needed to hide." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the San Francisco weather. The 3 women who had disappeared weren't random victims. They had been selected for specific reasons, and the bridge was where the final stage of their trafficking was taking place. Armed with this information, Frank began to piece together a more complete picture of what was happening. The women were being held somewhere in the city, probably one of Kozlov's warehouses, and then brought to the bridge in the early morning hours when traffic was minimal. The wet clothing suggested they were being transported by boat, possibly from a ship anchored in the bay or from one of the smaller ports along the coast. But why were witnesses seeing them asking for help? Frank's theory, developed through conversations with trafficking experts, was that the women were making desperate escape attempts during the transfer process. The bridge represented their last chance for freedom before being moved to their final destinations, possibly out of state or even out of the country. Frank's unofficial investigation led him to spend countless nights surveilling the area around the Golden Gate Bridge. He established observation points at various locations, sometimes working with Agent Chen and her team, sometimes alone. What they discovered over the course of several weeks painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal operation that used the bridge as just one component of a larger network. Using high-powered binoculars and night vision equipment, Frank observed patterns of activity that had previously gone unnoticed. Small boats would approach the rocky areas near the bridge's foundations around 2 a.m., typically on nights when fog provided natural cover. Figures would disembark and make their way up to the bridge level using maintenance paths that were supposed to be secured but had obviously been compromised. The breakthrough came on a foggy October night when Frank witnessed the entire operation unfold. From his position in the marine headlands, he watched through night vision scopes as a small speedboat approached the north tower of the bridge. 3 men disembarked, along with what appeared to be 2 women whose hands were bound. Frank immediately radioed Agent Chen, who was coordinating with FBI surveillance teams positioned at various points around the bridge. "This is it," he whispered into his radio. "They're here, North Tower, moving up toward the walkway." What happened next would later be described in FBI reports as a textbook rescue operation, but for Frank, watching through his scope, it felt like an eternity of tension and fear. The traffickers had brought their victims onto the pedestrian walkway and were apparently waiting for a vehicle pickup when one of the women broke free from her restraints. Frank watched as the woman, later identified as Maria Santos, who had been missing from her East Bay home for 6 days, ran toward the center of the bridge, screaming for help. Her clothing was indeed wet, having been kept in the boat's lower compartment during transport. This explained the consistent witness reports of women in wet clothing appearing on the bridge. The traffickers pursued Maria, and Frank could see that they were carrying rope and what appeared to be tranquilizer equipment. The plan, as it became clear later, was to subdue any victim who tried to escape and make it appear as though they had jumped from the bridge voluntarily. But this time, Agent Chen's team was ready. FBI agents emerged from concealment at both ends of the bridge, trapping the traffickers in the middle. The arrest was swift and decisive, with all 3 perpetrators taken into custody without violence. Maria Santos was rescued unharmed, though severely traumatized by her experience. The second victim present that night was Elena Petrov, who had been kidnapped 3 months earlier from her job at a Russian restaurant in the Richmond district. Elena's case had never been reported to police because Kozlov's organization had told her family that she owed money to dangerous people and had fled the city voluntarily. In the days following the arrests, Frank worked closely with Agent Chen and the FBI's task force to unravel the full scope of Kozlov's operation. Search warrants executed at Pacific Maritime Solutions and several associated properties revealed a network of warehouses, safe houses, and transport facilities that had been operating for years. Most importantly, they found evidence that explained the fate of Sarah Chen, Jennifer Walsh, and Rebecca Martinez. All 3 women had been taken by Kozlov's organization, but unlike Maria Santos and Elena Petrov, they had not been rescued in time. Intelligence gathered from arrested suspects and seized documents indicated that the 3 women had been transported out of the San Francisco area within days of their kidnapping, likely destined for forced labor situations in other states. Frank's case files, now part of the FBI's evidence collection, contained detailed reconstructions of each woman's final hours of freedom. Sarah Chen had indeed encountered Kozlov's hunters on the bridge, just as witness Marcus Williams had described. But rather than jumping or being thrown from the bridge, she had been recaptured and taken to a warehouse in Oakland before being moved out of state. Jennifer Walsh's encounter with traffickers had been even more tragic. According to statements from arrested suspects, Jennifer had been specifically targeted because of her work with vulnerable populations. Kozlov's organization had identified her as someone who might not be immediately missed, since she often worked irregular hours and lived alone. Rebecca Martinez's case was the most complex, involving her attempted escape and recapture, exactly as witnesses Tom Harrison and Lisa Parks had described. The rope marks Frank had found on the bridge railing were indeed from the equipment used to retrieve Rebecca from her hiding spot on the maintenance ledge. The investigation ultimately led to the arrest and conviction of Viktor Kozlov and 17 members of his organization. The case became a landmark prosecution for human trafficking on the West Coast, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison for the various defendants. But for Frank Morrison, sitting in his Buick on that foggy October morning months later, the resolution of the case brought little satisfaction. 3 women were still missing, their families still searching for answers, still hoping for their return. The wet footprints on the Golden Gate Bridge had told a story of desperation and lost hope, of final moments of freedom before disappearing into a criminal underworld that most people preferred not to acknowledge. Agent Chen had told Frank that their investigation had likely saved dozens of future victims by shutting down Kozlov's operation. Federal prosecutors were using evidence from the San Francisco case to build similar cases in other cities where the trafficking network had operated. But Frank couldn't shake the image of those women, terrified and alone, making their final desperate pleas for help on the bridge where so many others had ended their own lives voluntarily. As Frank closes his case file and starts his car, the morning fog begins to lift, revealing the full majesty of the Golden Gate Bridge. The structure stands unchanged, a testament to human engineering and ambition, but also a reminder of the darker aspects of human nature that lurk in the shadows of even the most beautiful places. The bridge is never empty, Frank thinks to himself as he drives away. Even when no one is visible on its walkways, it carries the weight of all the stories that have unfolded there. Stories of triumph and tragedy, of hope and despair, of lives saved and lives lost. The wet footprints that had started his investigation were gone now, washed away by rain and fog and time. But the memory of what they represented, the final traces of women who had fought for their freedom against impossible odds, would remain with Frank Morrison for the rest of his life. In the months that followed, Frank worked with victim advocacy groups to establish new protocols for responding to reports of suspicious activity around the Golden Gate Bridge. His experience had shown that what appeared to be suicide attempts or mental health crises might actually be something far more sinister, requiring a different kind of response from law enforcement and emergency services. The 3 families affected by the case, the Chens, the Walshes, and the Martinezes, formed a support group that advocated for stronger anti-trafficking legislation and better resources for victims of human trafficking. They also worked to raise awareness about the signs of trafficking and the importance of trusting witness reports, even when they seemed unusual or unlikely. Marcus Williams, Elena Rodriguez, Tom Harrison, and Lisa Parks, the witnesses whose accounts had been crucial to solving the case, also came together to form a neighborhood watch program focused on the areas around the Golden Gate Bridge. They understood that their willingness to come forward and share their stories, despite their initial fear and uncertainty, had been essential to stopping Kozlov's operation and rescuing Maria Santos and Elena Petrov. The Golden Gate Bridge itself became a symbol of both the dangers that vulnerable people face and the power of community action to protect them. New lighting was installed along the pedestrian walkways. Emergency phones were upgraded, and security patrols were increased during the early morning hours when criminal activity was most likely to occur. For Frank Morrison, now fully retired from law enforcement, the case represented both the culmination of his career and the beginning of a new chapter focused on advocacy and education. He regularly spoke at conferences about human trafficking, sharing the lessons learned from the Golden Gate Bridge investigation and emphasizing the importance of taking unusual witness reports seriously. The story of the wet footprints on the Golden Gate Bridge became a training case study used by FBI agents, local police, and social workers across the country. It demonstrated how criminal organizations adapt their methods to exploit iconic locations, and how careful investigation can reveal patterns that might otherwise be dismissed as coincidence or mental illness. As the fog rolls in from the Pacific Ocean and wraps around the Golden Gate Bridge's towers once again, the structure stands as a reminder that truth can be stranger and more complex than fiction. The women in wet clothing who had appeared on the bridge in the early morning hours were not supernatural apparitions, but real people fighting for their lives against a criminal organization that had turned one of America's most beautiful landmarks into a hunting ground. The bridge is never empty, because it carries the weight of all these stories, all these lives that have intersected with its red towers and steel cables. Some stories end in tragedy, others in triumph, but all of them remind us that behind every mystery, every unexplained phenomenon, there are real people with real experiences that deserve to be heard and understood. This story is a work of fiction. While it addresses real issues like human trafficking and incorporates authentic details about San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge, all characters, events, and specific organizations mentioned are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased or actual events, is purely coincidental. The Golden Gate Bridge is a real landmark, but the events described in this story never occurred there.